Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 327 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. If you've ever taken a counselling course, whether at certificate level or to master's degree, chances are you've encountered a personal development or process group. For some, these groups can be transformative and life-affirming. For others, they may feel confused, overwhelmed, or even like a waste of time. The quality of the experience often hinges on the facilitator and how they structure the group dynamic. So I'm thrilled to welcome back Dr. Sonja Falck. Today, she will give us a glimpse into her insightful lecture from the CPD library, where she unpacks the art of facilitating personal development groups. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 327 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to welcome you to our three topics, starting off with ethical sustainable practice, where today we're going to be delving into supervision, but a deep dive into the 7I model of supervision. It's an interesting topic, this. You might have a listen to this and see supervision in a very different light, because you'll be having a peek behind the curtains if your supervisor's using that model. We then go into practice matters, and today Rory has already introduced Dr. Sonja Falck about a lecture in the CPD library, and that is facilitating personal development groups. So be sure to check that out in the CPD library if you are a member, but stick around for that interview. And then we recognise you, our students in student services, and today accessing supervision before going into placement. It's that time of year, many students heading off into placement. Do I go to supervision after I've done a few hours of practice, or do I go before I go into my placement? Delving deep into that. So, theme of supervision, starting us off, Rory, the 7-eyed model of supervision. What is a 7-eyed model?
Well, that's really interesting. You should ask, Ken. And I think if we have to wind back time a bit, in the 70s, when counselling was a cottage industry, there wasn't any concept of supervision as such. They used to have what they used to call co-counselling, where you would just visit a colleague and talk about your practice. And then there was a bit of a groundbreaking book came out in 1985. So not that long ago, really, 1985, not that long ago, called On Learning from the Patient by Patrick Casement. And he was a psychoanalyst, and he basically wrote the first book on how supervision and what we learn from our clients and our practice, and of course ourselves. But not longer after that, in fact in the same year, Peter Hawkins and Robin Showat wrote a book called The Helping Professions, and they brought a model of supervision, and that model of supervision is still used today, and it's called the 7-eyed model. And the reason that supervisors train in the 7-9 model, and it's not the only model of supervision. There are different models of supervision, I have to say, but predominantly, I think if you're in the UK, most of the supervisors would use a 7-9 model. It's 7 different ways of looking at the client presentation and related relationships. So if you think, you go to maybe a museum and you see a sculpture, you see people walking around it, don't you? If you've ever been to a museum, or maybe you've seen a sculpture in your local park or open air area, people walk around it and they look, and what they're doing is they're looking from different perspectives. And this is exactly what the 7-9 model does in counselling. It asks the supervisee to look at their practice through different optics in different ways to get a real sense of what's going on.
Beautifully introduced. Wowzers. Yes, a little bit of history there for the history buffs. And of course, what we're talking about now is clinical supervision. And the thing I found interesting is the 7-9 model is not exclusively used by counsellors and psychotherapists. It is used by clinicians, and one of the models that is used in the UK in the NHS. And I think we start this off just by defining what clinical supervision is and what is the difference between maybe managerial supervision and clinical supervision, Rory. So I'll kick us off, of course, saying that managerial supervision, you would expect if you're working in an agency that you're going to have a line manager. They're going to want to make sure that you're okay in your job, that you're safe in the building, and that there's somebody to take the calls and get back. They may have documentation that they provide for you, and there's an element of you maybe checking in with them if you've got a challenge or something like that. But it's very different to clinical supervision. What would you say is the biggest differentiator so we can see them as completely different?
One's about the business or the organisation, and the other's about the client. So if you're having managerial supervision, it's usually the things where everybody who's ever worked in a job will know about it. It's the HR department. It's looking at performance. It's looking at holidays. It's looking at career development. It's looking at it could be looking at complaints or underperformance. It's all the things that everybody does who works in an organisation. Clinical supervision is solely focused on the client. And here's the thing. Ideally, not always, but ideally, it should be external of the organisation. Why is that? Because in supervision, you should be able to bring the entirety of your practice. And that includes, in some cases, critiquing the organisation you're working with and getting a sense of how you might speak to power. And certainly through the years that I was in practice, I found that very helpful. There were times when I had to, go to supervision, yes, with client work, but also with a more area of difficulty within the organisation I work for that was affecting client work. And I would talk about what I could do with that. And I think that's very liberating to be able to say to someone without fear of losing your job, I just think they've got it wrong. And I think they've got it wrong in this way. And I think this is what they could do better. And I don't know what to do. And as my supervisor used to say to me, she used to sit in the chair. And if you're listening to, all those years that we worked together, she would say, right, Rory, so what do you think you should do? And always the start. I could have paid for myself to say that. I could have actually just saved the money and paid for myself. But and she gave me courage and encouragement to challenge. And sometimes I came away. Other people went, "Yeah, I get that, Rory." And sometimes he went, "We're not going to change it." But it allowed me to separate work from practice and put, crucially, the client first.
Yes, I love how you've outlined that, and I've said this often. From your very first placement hour through all of your practice as a counsellor. It doesn't matter whether you're in private practice or working within various different agencies over the arc of your career. It is always your practice from that very first minute you see your first placement client till the time you say, okay, that's it for me. You will have different managerial supervisors within different agencies and within different times of that arc. And you may even have different clinical supervisors along the way as well. Supervisor can stay with you if you leave an agency. You can still maybe keep the same supervisor if they are still serving you. And I think one of the major differences for me is that if you are a counsellor and you're going in for clinical supervision, you're going to be working with a fellow counsellor, someone who is trained to become a counsellor as well. But not only that, they will have done a further qualification to become a clinical supervisor. It's specialist training within the area of supervision, whereas a managerial supervisor may not even be a fellow counsellor. It could be somebody from HR. It could be just a manager over a department. There might be a counsellor, but there might not be, and they may not have to have done any specialist training. And as you said, Rory, the big differentiator here is it's the person that you will see and take your client work to. And your supervisor is there in service, your clinical supervisor is there in service of your clients, but also in a way there for you as well. As you were saying, Rory, you felt empowered and encouraged by your supervisor, which is personal. It helps us show up better for our clients. And there's a question often of how much supervision I need. We see this all the time in the Counselling Tutor Facebook group. Join the group. If you're not a member, go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor and come and join thousands and thousands of other counsellors and students of counselling. And here in the UK, it's typically you would see your supervisor for 1.5 hours for every 12 hours of client work you do, or you'd see them once a month, whichever one comes first. So if you're doing 24 hours of counselling, you'd probably see your supervisor halfway through the month because you've done 12 hours. And it's so that you can kind of amass what you're taking in from those clients and you don't kind of lose the train of thought on that. You're going to be keeping records for going to see your supervisor, and your supervisor may even keep a record that you were there. And now we're going to go into the three main areas of supervision before we delve into that kind of seven-eyed model that we promised at the beginning, and that's formative, normative, and restorative. These are the three areas of supervision, what you refer to in our training course, Rory, as the triangle of supervision. And I wonder if you can explain how they kind of balance one another out.
Yes, well, a part of being a supervisor, and I speak as a supervisor or someone who's supervised for many years, is working out where on the path the supervisee is. And what I mean by that is, are they a experienced practitioner with many years of practice and a lot of CPD, or are they maybe a student? And depending on that, I may then start a position by looking at the supervisee, maybe a student. Let's say we get a student, and I may say they need more formative information. So formative is information, which brings us to another point about supervision. There is an element of direction. It's not non-directive. Supervision is lightly, I would say, directive. So if we look at the formative, we think of information, formative information. So it may be that you're filling in the gaps. You're the cement between the bricks of the training they're doing. Yeah, you're filling in those gaps and pointing it up nicely to use the metaphor of bricklayer, to make sure that what they're doing is solid. And that can be sharing reflections from your own practice about client presentations. It can be giving practical information about things like if their people's notes are asked for, or if they need to sign up with data protection, or to clarify things. So that's the normative. And then you have the formative. So that's the formative side. Then you have the normative side, and that's when your supervisee comes in. This could be any level of supervisee, right from stage one, which is the student, right up to 3 and 3+. We measure them 1, 2, 3. probably another podcast. And that's someone who's very, very experienced. And they may come in and they go, I've just let this client down. I just don't know what I could do to help this client. And it's normative. It's trying to, that's my mistake. That's restorative. That restorative side is trying to bring back the client, bring back the supervisee, to a state, sort of give them support when they're struggling with clients. So formative is information. Restorative is supporting the supervisor if they're struggling with clients or they may feel uncertain of what they do. And then we have normative, which is the sort of managerial side of things. It might be about getting your practice in order, getting a supervisor into a position. This usually uses this a lot when someone starts in private practice. You're trying to work out where their competence lies in things like assessment, things like signing up for GDPR, making sure that they've got the paperwork and their insurances and all that type of thing. And it's a triangle. And what can happen is you may get someone who comes in wanting information, so that's the formative. And then through that journey, you might find yourself in a restorative position. In other words, you talk about it, you go, it's just too much to do all this. It's just too much. In which case you would say, oh, well, let's just talk about what's going on for you here and try and give that restore them to being, just get them back on track a bit. So that's the triangle: normative, formative, and restorative.
Thank you.
Yes.
See, I got the benefit of having the super duper handout here on hand, so I can tell you the formative is growth based, as you've mentioned, kind of sharing information. Normative is monitoring based, so client might present, a supervisee might present to the supervisor with something, and the supervisor may say, well, what does your ethical framework say about that, and call on you. They're almost kind of monitoring what you're doing and getting you as the counsellor to monitor your own practice as well. You might say, oh, I've just finished my brand new website, I'm all excited, supervisor. And your supervisor may say, that's interesting, have you looked to the ICO and what the needs are? What's ICO? Information Commissioner's Office is here in the UK, and it's regarding data protection and privacy policies and the documents that we would be expected to have on a website. So they challenge you on monitoring, and of restorative you've beautifully described. It's kind of holding you as a counsellor as well. And I think what's really important to say here is restorative is not therapy. You may come in and you may say, I'm burnt out, I'm seeing too many clients, it's starting to trigger stuff from my own life. And of course, restorative, your supervisor is going to hold you there, but your supervisor may also then say, you know what, maybe it's time for you to step into your own personal therapy. And it's not unusual, as we've said many, many times, to step into therapy. It's a strength, not a weakness as a counsellor. You'll certainly have done that during your training to become a counsellor, and it's good practice to step into therapy whenever it is brought up, and specifically our supervisors hold that, can hold that view and help us in kind of identifying that. So we're now going to move on to the 7-eyed model of supervision that you beautifully introduced in the beginning. And I liked how you said it's like going to an art gallery. So when you go into supervision as a supervisee, your supervisor, it's almost like they're standing one side and looking and seeing one aspect, and then walking around and seeing a different aspect of you, and walking around and seeing a different aspect of you, your client, and your practice. And we start off, they're focuses, and they're called focuses, and there's 7 of them. I'm going to run through the 7 quickly, because we've got an entire, how long does it take to go through our clinical supervision training, Rory, and graduate? It's about a year, including the placement hours you would need to do. So to cover it in the next kind of 10-15 minutes, which we have for this section, is a big ask. It's a big piece of work. But the focus that the supervisor will have is, number 1, they're going to be asking you around your client, who the client is, how they show up. Number 2, the supervisee's intentions and interventions. How are you working with this client? What are you doing? What's your modality? What have you tried? What are you doing, and how are you working with that? the client supervisee relationship. Who is this client to you as the supervisee, or in this case, as the counsellor when you're in practice? What does that relationship look and feel like? Your own experiences as a counsellor, so in other words, the supervisee's own experiences, then the supervisee relationship. That's an important part of this as well, because it's a part of your supervision is the relationship you hold with your supervisor's own reflections, what your supervisor may think, feel, and share, and then wider context, what's going on outside of that relationship. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour, Rory. Let's do a sentence from you, or a little bit of an explanation. Expand on client for me, the focus on the client.
Yes, so I alluded to an art gallery and walking around looking at a sculpture or some piece of art, and you have to start off with the client first and foremost in the front of your mind, top of mind, as we say at Counselling Tutor, because if we don't have the client in focus, you don't explain to your supervisor who this client is, how they present, a little bit about them. We can lose focus on who the person is, because we're dealing with a real person, but also it speaks to respecting the client and realizing you're talking about a real person, not just a load of theories or interventions. There's a real person that's being discussed here, which is why it's always usually asked first, tell me about this client. Then supervisees interventions. So that could be how you're working with clients, and that could be things like where the direction the client's going in terms of what they want to look at and how you're supporting that. Or if you work in a different modality, it might be if you're a transactional analysis therapist, it might be looking at scripts, or you might be looking at ego states, that type of thing. If you're a CBT therapist, it might be about homework, all that sort of thing. So what are you doing? What are you bringing to it? And then the third one is the client-supervisee relationship. All therapy, and the research is never wrong on this, it's been out for years and years, it keeps getting repeated. The quality of the therapeutic relationship is one of the big arbitrators of successful therapy for clients. So by asking, how are you getting on with this client? And it might be you get someone say, actually, I don't like this client. There's something about this client. So what you would do then is you'd say, okay, tell me what is it? Well, there's something about how they speak or present. And as a supervisor, you would look at transference, because we've not spoken about transference for a bit. And you said, does this person remind you of anybody? And you go, well, now you mention it, remind me of my old boyfriend. And then you have to kind of say, well, actually, that's not your boyfriend. It just looks like it, and work through that. But checking the quality of the relationship is really, really important. Then for the supervisee's own experience. And again, how does it feel to work with this client? What's going on for you? And it might very well be that what's brought up has triggered stuff in the therapist. In which case, it's worth investigating there. So you can see the checks and balances as we go through here. And then 5, the supervisor-supervisee relationship. All therapy and all relationships, all therapy and all interactions really rely on the quality of the relationship. So it's useful for a supervisor to check in and say, how are things going? How do you feel about me saying that? And trying to build an equality to reduce the power. That's what this is really about. And then number 6, supervisor's own reflections. And that can be sharing a bit of your own practice. I've heard what you said about this client, and I wonder, if this was my client, I might be inclined to go in this direction, or try this, or try that. And that's about sharing, I guess, a bit of wisdom, a bit of clinical experience, to give a different perspective to how the supervisee may be working. And then finally, the wider context. 7 is the wider context. And I have to say, this has only been added in recently, I think 5 years ago. So I think in the 2019, 2020, maybe a bit earlier, 2017. But what you're asking in the wider context is, what's going on around this client. So it could be a work environment, it could be their home life, it could be where they are in the world. Remember, we do online and telephone counselling now, so it could be what's going on in the world around them. And that gives a sense of where the client's placed in the wider area of their lives. Very, very useful to get a sense of what the client's experiencing externally to what's happening in the therapy room. And that, in a bit of a nutshell, is the 7-eyed model.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting model because it does. I think you use checks and balances. It has checks and balances as it goes through. And I'll be honest, when I first went into supervision, I thought that my supervisor was just a counsellor with a lot more experience than I had, and they were now offering their wisdom to supervise. And what was actually going on behind the scenes was invisible to me until I trained as a clinical supervisor myself, and it was kind of the moment, and I could see what was actually going on. It's really interesting. So we run, Rory, you built a clinical supervision training course for counsellors and psychotherapists. If you're interested in training of that and you've been in practice for more than 2 years, so you're established in practice and you have a year, you want to challenge yourself, just go to counsellingtutor.com, and as we make this in real time, we're actually running our clinical supervision training course, but the next intake will be in April of 2025. You can join the mailing list and get all the information about what that entails and what the requirements are to join that if you're interested in. But what's really interesting is we have a community group within that, and quite recently it's kind of the early stages in the delivery of the course. I think it's been 2 of the live sessions that have been delivered. So many comments about, I'm going into my own supervision. I see it so differently now. I can see how my supervisor is working with the materials that I'm bringing. I'm changing how I bring myself to supervision, knowing this information. So it really is a great way to focus not only on servicing others as a supervisor, but it also enriches at a great level your own practice and how you look at your own practice. You were speaking, Rory, about earlier when you went to your supervisor and you would take in a challenge and your supervisor would say, well, what are you feeling around this, Rory? And that is your supervisor developing your internal supervisor. And there's no better way to develop your internal supervisor than to go on a supervision training course and become a supervisor.
There isn't.
And in Counselling Tutor, when we build these courses, I mean, that was years in the making, the clinical supervision training. And last year alone, we trained over 500 supervisors here in the UK. It's a very, very well put together course. And I think what I like about it is that it's revisitable. So you don't just arrive and get the information. The information is in a learning portal. So you can go through the theory part and then you go into live situations where you have the tutors present, who are themselves clinical supervisors and tutors. They hold teaching qualifications. They deliver this. You get to see live interactions or simulated sessions of all 7 of the eyes in the 7-eyed model. You then get to practice and do simulated sessions with peers, and the growth is absolutely amazing in that training. So if that interests you and you think, I'm ready, this is a time. But what I wanted to go to is in Counselling Tutor, when we build these courses, we don't just build them and go, let's make a supervision course. We have 2 things that we measure everything we do against: ethical, sustainability. So we believe in Counselling Tutor, and it's kind of what drives us, that we want counsellors to be ethical and sustainable. There's nothing worse than a counsellor being really ethical but not able to make a living. And we believe there's more sustainability in specialist niche areas, because if you're a supervisor, every counsellor needs a supervisor, so it instantly increases the client group, I guess, that you can see, although they would be supervisees. And it kind of is a self-feeding system, because Your supervisor has a supervisor who has a supervisor who has a supervisor. If you're out and you're a counsellor and you're working ethically, you've got a supervisor. So it really does open a new level of sustainability for practice, but also the ethics are reinforced, and it's a great way of re-looking at your own practice. Get the handout, the 7-eyed model of supervision. It covers the 7-eyed model. It's got a little bit of the history of that. It's got the difference between managerial supervision and counselling. It speaks about what counselling supervision entails, 3 main areas of supervision, the 7-eyed model, and then it goes into different types of supervision, which we haven't even dipped into today. But that is free of charge. You can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. Find today's podcast episode. It's episode 327. Download it, hold it in your hand, have it, refer to it whenever you like. Wow. Any final thoughts as we back out of supervision and the 7-eyed model, Rory?
Yeah, I thought I'd just share a little story from when I went back to my supervisor after training, and she asked me something. I said, "Aha, I see what you're doing there." I said, "I've done that in my supervision training," and she said, "Yeah," she said, "and I know that you're taking notice of the training because you've just told me." So I couldn't even get one over on her there. She was very sharp, Sue. But that's a case of really good supervision. You know, that knowing the supervisee, and she did it deliberately. She did it as part of supervision. She asked something that she knew that I'd pick up on and reflect back at that. That's what I've learned in my training. And what she was doing is she was doing what she should be doing. She was testing my level of knowledge to supervise what would become a supervisor. And that is good supervision. That's good supervision.
Well, there it is. That is today's ethical, sustainable practice. Hope you got something out of that. We now move into Practice Matters, CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where you can kind of put it down on your CPD tracker. And the information we cover here should enrich your practice. We always bring in the experts in certain topics and areas. And today particularly excites me, Rory, and I'll tell you why. One of the things I found most beneficial during my counselling training, and one of the things I miss the most, is the personal development groups, where we would take an hour, we would sit around, and there was a very special energy within the group, and we would kind of just say where we were and check in where we were. And it's incredible through the arc of training, my own training, seeing the development within myself, but then having the privilege of standing side by side with you, Rory, training other counsellors and watching their personal development blossom and grow within those groups. And I really missed the group when I left, and I wished there was something I could key into. And I see it again in the Facebook group when students graduate. It's that they kind of reach out saying, "Hey, are there any PD groups that I can join? I'm really missing mine." And you met up with Dr. Sonja to speak about this very topic, Rory.
I did. I met up with Dr. Sonja Falck, who's rather an expert in personal development process groups. And we talked about the importance of having some form of training to be a personal development facilitator. I had a look at the lecture she did, and I've got to be honest, I facilitated your PD group, Ken, because I was your tutor for a time. And it would have been so helpful if I'd have known this information then that Sonja has delivered in her lecture. So if you are a budding tutor, or you are a tutor already and think, I'd love to get more information on personal development groups, it's really not to be missed. I asked her about the lecture, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Personal development groups are a crucial aspect of personal growth and are often a key element in formal training programs. Today, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Dr. Sonja Falck, who first appeared on episode 210 to discuss an insightful lecture she delivered for the CPD Library titled Facilitating Personal Development Groups. Dr. Falck, thank you so much for joining us again.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So I guess the first question is, first of all, I think the first question is, what is a PD group? We use a lot of acronyms, don't we, in counselling? What is a PD group?
PD stands for personal development. So it's a personal development group. And in some trainings, they call it that. In some trainings, they call it a process group or an experiential group. But they all are essentially the same kind of animal that is very common in counselling and psychotherapy trainings.
Yes, and you've hit on that. They are predominantly a feature of trainings, certainly first trainings in counselling and psychotherapy. Why are they included? It might sound an obvious question, but why are they included in training? What is the value of a PD group or a process group in training?
Yeah, well, that actually goes back to Carl Rogers, who first talked about how students who participated in what he called a structureless group, where the main task was to explore the interactions between them in the here and now, that students who participated in a group like that came out of it with greater confidence in the way they conducted their roles as counsellors. And so that's how including a group like that in trainings came to be a traditional thing to do. And really the idea is that when you interact with other people in a controlled environment where it's like a laboratory, you're really watching and listening and learning about how people react to you, how you react to them, what sorts of dynamics develop between people. You become much more confident in how to manage those sorts of dynamics when they come up in the consulting room, and the kinds of different personalities that you encounter and interact with in that way prepare you for the kinds of clients you might have and make you feel much more adept at knowing how to deal with the sorts of things different people make you feel when you're in conversation with them.
I think that's very interesting because I'm sure there'll be a lot of students listening to this who may think, well, why do I have to sit in a circle and stare at my feet for an hour every week? And I think you just articulated perfectly why personal development groups exist and how they benefit the overall shape of training and the forming of a competent practitioner. And also, I also think that it's a unique opportunity, one we don't get in any other walk of life, to sit in front of someone else and really experience people in a open and hopefully honest way. I can't think of anywhere else in my life where I've experienced that.
It is a unique opportunity, and because it's in a private, confidential environment and it's facilitated by somebody who is professionally trained, you can go to places in the conversation that people tend to totally avoid in social conversations. And that is a very different experience of finding out how people are really feeling, or how a conversation really impacted them, or who you really remind them of, or what annoying mannerisms you might have that everybody notices except you. And people don't tell you that socially because they're too polite. But in a PD group, you learn ways of being able to share those things in a kind and thoughtful way that everybody in the group can really benefit from.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's worth just pointing out that PD groups don't only exist in training. I know that you've done a lot of work around PD groups for qualified colleagues and the benefits of ongoing personal development or encounter groups as a qualified professional.
Yes, and I also have in my private practice a PD group where I have participants who are not even in the counselling profession, because any human being can benefit from that opportunity to learn and experience in that way. It is big personal development growth for anybody who joins.
Yes, and I guess
something I did want to say is that when you say students are sometimes bewildered and say, why do I have to spend an hour doing this every week? what I've experienced in the university where I work is that PD groups are often not explained. So students go into them just not really knowing what to expect and not having a clear rationale for what the purpose is and how they work and how to get the best out of them. And that's why I've even done this training for you on facilitating personal development groups, because I found that facilitators sometimes themselves have not had specific training in it. And they also don't think that explaining clearly to clients or students what's going on will help them get more out of the experience. So that's why I thought it's a resource that is needed.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. Before we pressed the record button, I was saying to Dr. Falck that I wish I'd have had the benefit of this wisdom when I was a trainer running a process or personal development groups, because there's just so much in this lecture. And I guess that brings me to the question at hand. And I think you partially answered it. Why is it important that people who facilitate PD groups have a model or a structure that they can work to? Why, and I guess this is what the lecture's about. Why is it important?
Well, it's a little bit like saying, why is it important to go into a jungle with a map? If you go into the jungle with no map, well, you just have no idea where you are, what could happen, how to manage what could happen. So having a bit of training in how to facilitate a group gives you that sort of map, and it helps you stick to the map. And when things get tricky or you're not sure what to do, then you can fall back on the guidelines that reassure you. I mean, a facilitator in a group can sometimes feel quite stressed by what's happening in the group and feel unsure about what to do. So if they've got some really sound principles, really good knowledge about what sorts of things happen in groups and why people behave the way they do in groups, then they can feel calm about that, and that can help them perform much better in their role facilitating it.
Yes, absolutely. And, one of the things that I've taken away from the lecture is that being a qualified counsellor or even being a qualified supervisor doesn't really equip you fully to be a PD facilitator. Reading the lecture, there's a lot more. It's the map, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And if you have trained in group therapy, or there's been a group therapy part of your training when you trained as a counsellor or psychotherapist, then you are much more prepared. But a lot of people don't have any kind of group training in their counselling training, and where I teach. Also, this is what made me think this is so important for people to know about, because when I first started at the university, I gave a lecture to third year students, so that's their final year of full-time training. In their third year, I gave them a lecture on working with groups and what sorts of things happen in groups. And at the end of that lecture, I had all these students coming up to me saying, I wish we'd had that lecture in the first year, because now we suddenly get it. We kind of see what that PD business was all about. And when I had that feedback, I thought, why not give that to people in the first year so they can really benefit from understanding what's going on?
Absolutely. And I would say if there's any tutors who are interested or people who may be going into teaching counselling who may be facilitating PD groups, I would say that this lecture is incredibly helpful. I mean, there's obviously a lot, it's an hour 40-minute lecture. There's obviously a lot more to look at as provided in the references, but it really does give a solid grounding and a solid. It's a map. It provides a map to effectively run a PD group, and I also sometimes think that, as a facilitator, it can slip one's mind, and maybe I'm talking about myself here, I am talking about myself, about the impact on the participants. Students or people in a personal development sit in a group. And I think sometimes it's good to consider, isn't it, what it's like for those who are participating.
Yeah, well, I'd say that's really crucial. because also people in the group often don't say in the moment how they are experiencing something or how they're feeling affected by something. And something I found quite fascinating when I run groups, and this is partly to do with those phases of group development, that at the beginning, when people don't know each other very well and they're still adjusting and they're still on best behavior, they might find something difficult, but they don't say anything about it. And then some weeks later, when the group has become more established and they're feeling more comfortable, almost every group I've ever run, there comes to a point some weeks into it where they suddenly start talking about what happened previously and they bring it up again. Yes. And then they say what they were really feeling at the time. So that thing about you can't think that the way people are behaving in the moment gives you everything about what they're actually feeling and experiencing. Sometimes they only tell you that weeks later.
Yes. And I think, there's lots of group dynamic models. And the one I trained in was the Tuckman one, where people start off with storming, and it can feel very stormy and a bit kind of disassociated, and people don't know where they are and who to trust. And then you move through that phase, and right at the end of that phase, it's actually forming, storming, norming, and performing. And I did some training recently where they talked about mourning, where people move away from a group and they mourn the loss of it. And that's a very real thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because people become, when the group is performing and it's going well, then the end of the group is a real loss. It's something that people have come to rely on. They know it's a safe space. They know they can get to speak about things and explore things there. It's quite a compelling space because it's like watching your favorite soap opera and you kind of really want to know what the next episode is. You end on a cliffhanger and you want to see the next episode. And then suddenly it's like, oh, the series is over. So, it's a bit sad when it's finished. And that's when people can really be helped to think about what have they learned and how do they take that into their life outside of the group so they can carry on benefiting from the things they've learned.
Yes, and that is part of a skill facilitator, isn't it? Not to just let the ending of the group come and go, but to actually get people involved in the ending and to be introspective of what it means to them.
Yeah, absolutely, to make it very deliberate. And I think all through a group to help the participants to understand the territory they're experiencing. So, normalizing the feelings that they're having a way of letting them know that these are the sorts of things that tend to come up. And, this is not news. This is not something to be anxious about. It's just kind of part of the normal experience.
Yes. Well, that's it. It is all about, it's an experiential group. And I think it's really interesting. A good facilitator is, I think, essential for any kind of process group. You alluded to Rogers and what he called T groups, I believe, which was his initial name for training groups and group work. And I've read quite a few books where people have done unfacilitated process groups, and they've ended in chaos. There's one that I read, which was, I think, in America, in the west coast of America, and the facilitators decided not to disclose that they were the facilitators. They just pretended. Sonja's laughing here. They decided just to pretend to be part of the group, and it ended in absolute anarchy with people wandering around, wondering why they'd bother turning up. So the point I'm coming to is that you have to show leadership. A PD facilitator is a leader.
Well, absolutely. And what you've just described sounds like a social experiment. And is it ethical to impose on a bunch of people a social experiment? Have they willingly chosen to participate in some kind of social experiment, or did they think they were getting something for their benefit as part of what they're being trained to do? So I think the behavior of a facilitator, being professional, being ethical, and making sure that they're not thinking about what their own interests are or what kind of thing they feel like trying out for fun or out of curiosity, but they're really thinking about the group participants and what state are they in and what do they need and what are we doing it for, and really staying on track with that. That's how you prevent disasters from happening.
Yes, and I've heard of some, real disasters in the post bag. I get mail with people explaining what their PD groups were like, and it sounds terribly unsafe or akin to Fight Club, quite frankly. Quite physically dangerous. And I don't know what your view is on this, but one of the things, even though I was a person-centred tutor, and I taught person-centred therapy for a long time, I wasn't immune to the impacts of transference, counter-transference. And I think that even if you're doing a humanistic personal development group, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, you have to keep in mind transference and counter-transference.
Well, I think transference and counter-transference are absolutely key concepts, just as much as Roger's contribution of genuineness and empathy. His core conditions were crucial contributions to the field. And no matter what orientation, what theoretical orientation you work from, if you don't use those core conditions, then you're not doing as well as you could be. I think transference and counter-transference are similarly very crucial concepts. And whether we understand them or not, whether we think about them or talk about them or not, they happen all the time. Because basically, we all approach new people and new experiences with patterns in our mind from the ones we've experienced in the past. And this is going to show up, whether you like it or not, or whether you talk about it or not.
Yes, and I think it's worth mentioning that transference is like a time machine, isn't it? Where you may meet someone new, very simply put, and it brings up feelings. It could be the very positive feelings or very negative feelings, but actually they're not about the person in front of you. They're about a person who may remind you of someone from your past. And counter-transference is, again, the same thing, how you react to the transference, how you react to it. And without having a knowledge of what's going on, transferentially, that can lead to some really big difficulties, both with the facilitator and also think within group members as well. I don't know if that's your experience.
Well, yes, and in a group, if you have, like, say, 10 people sitting in a circle, the fact that not all 10 people react to, say, the facilitator in the same way. Just last night, I was running a group, and we had this fascinating conversation where one person in the group had a bit of a sparring conversation with me, and somebody else in the group said, "Oh, I would never be able to talk to Sonja that way. Like, if I didn't like something Sonja was doing, like, I could never say it because I would just feel terrified." But why does one person in the group take me on and argue with me in a very feisty way and enjoy it, and another person in the group feel terrified of saying anything to me that they're afraid I wouldn't like? And the answer lies in transference. One person has a difficult experience with an authority figure or like a parent figure and are afraid of being punished if they aren't on best behavior. The other person hasn't had that experience and they feel much more free to kind of be rebellious with me.
Yes. I mean, that's a really great example. And it also highlights the robustness of the facilitator themselves, because in a sparring match, there are two people engaging in it. So both people have to be relatively robust to be able to manage that.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing about being a facilitator in a PD group. You have, between 9 and maybe 12 personalities in the circle around you, and each of them is probably going to be seeing you in a different way and thinking things of you that might be true, might be completely untrue. And when they treat you according to this pattern in their mind, you've got to be sort of up for noticing what they're expecting of you and being able to engage with that in a way that doesn't criticize that person, in a way that accepts that, for them, that's their way of managing relationships, but also be able to gently encourage them to notice what that is and how it differs from other people in the room. And, that's an interesting conversation to stir up within the group. I hope they will take away from it a recognition of the seriousness of thinking about PD groups and what's involved, and of the power that such groups hold. I explain in the lecture why being in a group is a powerful experience that it kind of elevates people's levels of anxiety, and to be curious about them so that they can do more reading, more training. There are many references in the resources that I have added to the lecture. And what I really hope for is that facilitators will go into groups themselves feeling more sure of the territory they can expect. They're holding the map and they know better how to go into that experience so that everybody in the group has a better and more productive experience out of it.
And I think that just looking at the lecture and hearing it presented, I think that's what people will get out of it. Facilitating Personal Development Groups by Dr. Sonja Falck is available now in the CPD library, and it just goes to say, Dr. Falck, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Dr. Sonja Falck. Thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. Counsellor CPD Library is where you will find that lecture. If you're a member, log in. If you're not a member, hey, it costs less than the price of a cup of coffee. Honestly, it does, for two per month to get access to all of the CPD lectures delivered by experts. I went out with my wife, Colette, Rory, recently. We went to Costa, which is a coffee brand here in the United Kingdom, if you're listening outside, and had a coffee. And I was looking and I was saying, is this really true? And I looked at it and it was about £6.50 for the two coffees. And I was going, yeah, it is. It's cheaper to be a member of a CPD library than to go for a cup of coffee these days. So there you go. And if you're interested, counsellingtutor.com is where you'll find those details. So, Student Services, we see you. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. Today, we're talking about accessing supervision. Do you do it before you go into placement? Do you do it after you've seen maybe some clients in placement and take what you've gained from there? What's your thoughts on this, Rory?
Well, my thoughts would be that good practice, and I think every tutor would agree with me, is that you get the services of a supervisor before you even see a client, and there's some good reasons for that. The main reason is that a lot of students, and I can understand why people would think this, to be honest, think, well, I'll do some hours, and at the end of those hours, I'll go and find myself a supervisor, because I am going to be supervised. But what happens is that you're not actually supervised until you sign a contract or make an agreement with a supervisor. You haven't got a supervisor. And so if anything goes wrong, you haven't got anywhere to go. So you might think, I'll do 4 hours and then I'll have a look at the supervision directory again and get myself a supervisor. Your first client comes in, there's a difficulty you're having. What do you do? What do you do? You have to go and find a supervisor. You have to contract with a supervisor. Then you have to talk about what's going on. it's a lot. So we always recommend, and I know other colleagues who teach say, go and find a supervisor. Go and find a supervisor, talk to a few, phone them up, see if they're a good fit for you. You know, at the top of the podcast, we talked about the 7I model and the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisor. That is massively important. And if you have a good relationship with your supervisor, then you can bring the scary stuff. Then you can bring the stuff where you think to yourself, I'm going to get in trouble here. I've done something wrong. When 99.9% of the time you haven't. It's just new to you. You've done something and you think it's the worst thing in the world, and actually it's not. So find yourself a supervisor first. And I would suggest seeing a few. And you can listen to your peers. I know a lot of peers said, oh, my supervisor's lovely. But I would say that each relationship is unique. Find out for yourself.
Yes. It's I like that you went straight to get your supervisor before you go into placement. And I know this is not always so, and I know this because I've worked in clinical supervision, offering supervision to students, and I've had students come in and say, you know, I've just seen 4 client hours and I'm now looking for a supervisor. Myself, because I was it was suggested during my training, I got my supervisor before going into practice, and I am so glad I did. It was about a month before I went into practice. I found a supervisor that was a fit for me, and I went and spoke with my supervisor, and we spent 1.5 hours planning my practice, making sure that all the boxes were ticked and making sure that I was ready ethically, and that I was feeling confident enough to go in and see my very, very first client, to have that very first client hour. And there are things that a supervisor will check with you. They'll do they'll check that you hold insurance before you go into practice. They're gonna make sure that you've got your ethical body paperwork done and that your membership is in place before you see your first client. They may ask you about the organization that you might be doing your placement in. They may ask you to get certain documentation and review it before going into that first session, policies and procedures within that organization. So I really felt that it was having the wisdom of another holding me. When I went in and I saw that first client, I was not alone. And it's true, you know, as a counsellor throughout the arc of your practice, you're not alone in the room with your client, because your supervisor is in a way there with you. And I went in and I was so glad that the preparation work had been done correctly. And I was able to be nervous for the right reasons. And what I mean by that is, I think anybody going in to see the first client, there's going to be butterflies. There's going to be an element of nervousness around that. But I was able to be nervous about the right things rather than, have I got everything right? Am I as prepared as I need to be? I knew I was prepared, so I could just focus on the nerves as being excitement for seeing my first client. Can you remember your trip to your supervisor before your first session, Rory? Can you recall that?
It's indelibly etched into my soul, Ken. It was such a formative experience. And you know, we talked at the top of the podcast about normative, formative, and restorative. And I think that when I went to see my supervisor, we went through all of those inquiries. The first was she asked me about what I had in place, you know, and where I was going. She wanted to know a little bit about the place. She wanted to know a little bit about who I'd be seeing, what kind of client groups. So she was doing the kind of managerial side, the soft managerial side that happens in supervision. Then we went into the formative role, where she talked about my understanding of the application of therapy I was using, person-centered therapy. And she told me a little bit about it. She gave me some scenarios. and how might you work with this, and how might you work with that. And by the time we'd gone through that, I was incredibly nervous. So she went into the restorative side and said, okay, no one knows everything, Rory, when they first start out. I don't know everything now, but I needed to know exactly where you were in the arc of your practice. She didn't use those words, but that's what she was doing. And when I left, I felt incredibly supported. I felt like I'd been given a bit of a nice audit of where I was at. And I knew exactly where I was at in terms of the journey of my practice, because that's not really addressed in training. That's addressed in supervision. As I said, the supervisor provides the mortar between the bricks of theory and training. They fill the gaps in and oversee a clinical work. So, yeah, I do remember my first training. I wrote about it in my book, Counselling Theory and Practice, and I think I did refer to it as like being dipped into a bath of acid, like a door being stripped of all its old paint before rising again to have a nice floss put on me.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, I work a little bit behind the scenes in the counsellingtutor.com website. And one of the things we look at is what are people searching for, because it informs the kind of content that we may build and put out, because we want to be serving with what has actually been searched. And so often, first counselling session is searched on our website.
Yeah.
And we have actually got a beautiful article on first counselling session and how to prepare and what to think about and what that might feel like when you go into that first session. But when I do look at that search, there's a part of me that hopes that it's an additional layer of security going into practice, and that the people that are searching that have actually got a supervisor where they've taken this to their supervisor before going into practice, because you really are doing yourself the greatest of favors, and you are also serving your client while you're in placement by doing so. And during my first session, before I'd seen any clients, I remember looking over what that first session might be like, how it might run. And, you know, we've just covered the 7I model in ethical sustainable practice in this very podcast. And the very first is looking at the client. And I didn't know who this client would be. I had no idea who this client would be. But what my supervisor still worked with the same model and said, you know, how might you feel when you first meet this client? I wonder who they might be. And obviously I couldn't bring any part of the client, but I was certainly able to almost put myself in the situation, and I could feel in supervision that the little butterflies were going in my tummy. And I was saying, wow, you know, I think I'm going to be so nervous in the few minutes of countdown before that client walks in. And there was a holding of me within that, a gentle holding of that's okay. It shows that I care. If I wasn't nervous, you know, then I wouldn't care. You know, that nervousness was showing that I did care, and it was maybe a good sign because I wanted to do best by the client. And just having that permission, normalizing it, that it's okay to feel that before the first session. When those feelings did come up, they didn't overwhelm me. I looked at them differently and went, wow, yeah, I feel like this because I really care. And I felt prepared going in. And a first session, you might cover it in your counselling studies of what you do in a first session. And it's great having a handout with a load of points on it, but it's very different when it's real. Yeah. And what you might do with a supervisor, you know, you can simulate what a first session might be, and your supervisor can kind of lead you through that and say, okay, I'm the client. What might you do? What might you say first? How might you introduce yourself? How do you introduce yourself as a placement counsellor, not a qualified counsellor, and all of the ethical requirements that you would put in there in the beginning, and just having that practice run, I guess, because we don't really, well, certainly not in my training, you don't really get an opportunity to practice that first session with in your simulated skills, although you would need to do contracting and kind of thing. But it's different when it's really your first session, going in there. So all the recommendations point to find a supervisor first, find the right supervisor. So give yourself enough runway. If you know you're going into practice in 2 months, great time to start looking around for a supervisor. Do meet up, as Rory said, with a few, see who resonates with you, and then book a session in and go in and prepare yourself for practice before client contact. Any last thoughts, Rory?
Yeah, I recently finished my clinical work in 2024, and my last supervision, I gave my supervisor a present. I gave her a brass compass, and she said, "That's very kind. Why did you choose this?" I said, "Because you always showed me the way." And I think if there's anything that sums up good supervision, it is literally like having a compass with you. If you've got a compass, you always know the direction you're going. It's always steadfast, and in my experience, they always work. So I'll just throw that in. But yeah, have had 23 years of supervision, and I have to say that it was the most affirming thing that I've had in my life, personally and professionally. So if you get it right, it can make all the difference. Really, all the difference.
Yeah, it is. Today there's been a theme on supervision. We've mentioned that we run clinical supervision training, and stepping up as a supervisor is a privilege because you get to be that for others. And hey, wow, it's just very, very powerful. This has been episode 327 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yes, we started off with ethical, sustainable practice, and we pulled the curtain behind supervision to look at the engine inside, rather like pulling the curtain back at the Wizard of Oz to find out how it's operated, and looked at the 7-eyed model of supervision and how it works and how it's practiced in reality. In Practice Matters, I spoke with Dr. Sonja Falck about her lecture in the CPD library on facilitating PD groups. Rich, detailed information about how to be a really effective PD facilitator and what you need to put in place. And then in student services, we talked about accessing supervision before you go into placement, what you need to think about, how to choose a supervisor, and to make sure that you're ready to sit in front of the client with a degree of confidence and be able to give them your very best attention. As always, I'd like to thank those people who like, comment and subscribe, especially on our iTunes platform, who click on and give us a review. And also for those people who share widely the podcast, doing their colleagues and their peers a favour and saying, have you heard this? This might be useful. Have you heard these two guys? Have a listen to them. We always like it when people share. So thank you very much for that. And as always, stay grounded. Stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.